Welcome to Seekers and Shifters, where we talk to the world's foremost experts in personal growth and development and ask them everything we really want to know. Hey there, Seekers and Shifters. It's Michelle. And on this week's episode, we have my friend Dheeraj Chand. So I asked Dheeraj to come on the show because he's a Mason. And not only is he a Mason, but he's like a legacy Mason in terms of his going back generations in his family have been Masons. And I've always been fascinated by the Masons, especially as they start to intersect with the esoteric and the mystical. And also as a woman, somebody who is not allowed to be in the Masons and have only been able to kind of hear about it from friends, male friends and clients that are in the Masons or involved in the Masons. So we got into a really interesting discussion, really dived into the gender aspect of things and whether we think it's important to have different gender organizations that are one gender organizations. What do we think men and women are different? Do we think that need is there? I think you'll really enjoy listening to this one. So check it out. As always, let me know what you think. Drop us a like, drop us a comment, drop us a subscribe. We love hearing from you guys and enjoy this episode. Dheeraj, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Michelle. My name is Dheeraj Chand. I live in Austin, Texas, and I work in polling, data analysis, and redistricting. I am also a legacy Freemason, and I really like old things.
I love it when my political friends intersect with the woo. And we don't get to have many political friends on the show, so I'm glad you're here today. I'm really excited to talk to you about the Masons and get into all of that because I obviously am not allowed in the Masons, but I have friends and clients, even an ex-boyfriend that was deep into the Masons, and I've heard some things that start to get into the mystical and start to get into the woo at certain levels. And so I kind of want to dive into whatever you're comfortable sharing. We know that you have taken some vows not to share certain things, and we respect those boundaries and those obligations. But whatever you're comfortable sharing is cool with me. Can we start by just asking, how did you get into this? I know you've told me that you said your legacy, like your family's been in it for a long time. Can you kind of walk us into how that worked?
Until I was married, the single greatest person I've ever known in my life was my father. I grew up thinking, if I am lucky, the best thing I will do in my life is be a fraction like that man. And I still kind of believe that. Now I believe if I'm lucky, I'll be a fraction like my son. And if I'm lucky, I'll be a fraction like his mom. But so my list has sort of expanded. But my father was a Mason and still, I guess he still is. And growing up, we lived in an expat community. We lived overseas. There was a lot of discussion around how you get people of different backgrounds to work together and to socialize together and people to do things. And I was so impressed watching the fraternity bring people who are Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, all from different ethnic backgrounds to come together to do things like build a refugee camp for orphans because we had Vietnamese refugees where I lived. And they built that. And this was Masonry, who got a bunch of guys to give up their weekends to build something. A bunch of guys from different backgrounds who had nothing in common, aside from a commitment to doing something good together. And I watched my dad, and my dad was this very gentle, my dad is a very gentle, erudite person, a sort of towering edifice of manhood. And he would speak often and quote Masonic authors. And he would talk about Masonry being a way to understand what is universal in humanity. And so when it came time for me to be an adult and do it on my own, I wanted to be just like my dad.
I love that. So it didn't feel like an obligation to you then. You felt like it was a choice.
Obligation is an interesting choice of word. There's a lot that goes into ethnic traditions and family legacies, especially when you're immigrants. Building new traditions in America is hard. You've just landed here away from everyone and everything. And I thought in some sense it was important to do something that had been important to my father, to build a new pattern so that should I ever have a child, he would be able to do it. And my nephew, who was born before I had a son, my nephew was inspired. I got my nephew involved in the youth organization, which is called Dimole. And, it looks like it's going to be a family tradition. And I'm really happy about that it's going to persist in America in this branch of our family.
I think that's a really cool connection. I mean, obviously, Mason's a worldwide organization dating back to, we can talk about the history. There's some dispute about exactly where where it did, but a long time, right? Like Knights Templar and some of the things that came out of 1100, 1300, and spread all over the world. So very cool to have that connection with your immigrant family and coming over here. I think one of the challenges in an organization like the Masons is that it's run by local chapters, right? Like essentially. And those local chapters tend to have different ways of doing things in different politics. You're a political guy. Sometimes those chapter politics get a little fringe in one way or the other, and then the entire organization comes under fire for something a local chapter did. Can you? I see that's resonating with you. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
So one way I like to talk about this is by saying that Masonry is at its best understood as parallel to Protestantism. And what I mean by that is that it's a very bottom-up, gathered chapter mentality, right? So one of the big problems they had in England and in continental Europe was this notion of the established church, which is if you not only was it a part of government, but if you lived somewhere, this was your geographically assigned church. You just have to go there, right? And it was called the established church. And this was the contradictory idea was the gathered church, which was people just came together, right? And this became a very deeply Protestant idea. And many of our ideas of freedom of association and movement come from that. And Masonry is very similar, which is there's this idea that we all believe in the fraternity, but how we choose to believe in the fraternity, we choose to express that belief is in the gathering. And how we gather is, very deeply personal. One might say idiomatic is a very good way to put it. It can be a little tough sometimes when there are idioms and patterns that we find discomforting, right? What I find really difficult and challenging and yet uplifting about the fraternity is that it forces me to really think about what am I actually unhappy about versus what am I simply uncomfortable with because of unfamiliarity. So, you take someone like me who is what I like to call a fountain pen Indian, somebody who carries a pocket protector full of beautiful fountain pens, bow tie guy, jacket with a lapel pin, right? You put me in suburban Texas on the fringes of suburban rural, which is where my parents live. I'm going to be going to something that looks like a small wood shack church lodge. We call our individual chapters lodges. And one might think that I don't fit in, but Masonry actually does a really good job of stressing, this is some language you'll hear, the internal, not the external qualifications that recommend a man to be being a Mason and remain a Mason for that matter. And so when we are together, these things like, oh, do you speak with an accent? Do you spell verbs with an S instead of a Z? Do you mean say momentarily to mean for a short time rather than in a short time? These things become very trivial. They don't really matter. We sort of really come together in fraternity around the ideas of self-improvement and learning. But it can be very tough sometimes when there are disagreements. There are some people, for example, who have views on the nature of the fraternity that really matter. And they matter in the same way that any religious view or para-religious view will matter. And it's important to be able to engage substantive disagreement respectfully and without animus. And I think that's what the fraternity teaches us how to do.
What's interesting about this, and I mean, obviously you knew this was going to come up, but there's this organization that's become incredibly inclusive in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, right? I heard, it doesn't matter what religion you are as long as there's some kind of higher power belief, right? Is one of the tenets of Masonry. And then, of course, still not gender inclusive. We're recording this in the context of there just being a whole gender blow up with the Olympics last week. People are going to be hearing this maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks from now, so that hopefully they remember what we're talking about. And do you think in this day and age it's still important to have an organization that is all men, or like a space for all men, however that's defined? And is that defined at this point by the local lodges, or is that defined at some kind of international level?
So first, this is a great question. Secondly, yes, I think it is important. Third, I think it is important at every level to have organizations for both men and women. And I can explain why. I think that one of the great sort of mistakes we make as, let's just say, left-oriented people, right? And I'm saying this meaning you and me. I don't know who your listeners are, but you and I, because of our professional backgrounds, I can assume we have, say, some sort of sinister orientation, right? We make the mistake that different axes of identity are equally dispositive and equally determinative of identity, right? When in 2016, I was talking to my then wife, one of the things she said to me was, we were talking about the primary, and I mentioned that it would not matter to me if there were an Indian person running. What mattered to me was how this person would govern. And, I would feel, as such, I felt way more represented by Bernie Sanders than I did anybody else. And her response was, well, that's fine because that can be how men think. But to a woman, and to most women, it is very salient whether or not someone is a woman, right? You will feel a certain solidarity and kinship. And one might, to use the language of statistics, one might say that it is a stronger functor of identity accordingly, right? Than, say, other things. So, for example, she said, similarly, she feels more of a bond with a woman of any other ethnicity or race than she does another Indian person, even another Indian person of her same ethnicity, or even same down to like village background, right? If that person were a man. And I think this is important, right? Which tells me that there's something very important about what we want to call sex or gender. And I'm just going to use these terms interchangeably because I just do. And I think from what I have noticed over the years, there, aside from in very specific cases, which involve very deep relationships with people individually, which transcend certain kinds of boundaries, men and women behave very differently in entirely homosocial environments than they do in heterosocial environments. And I think you mentioned the sport environment. This is one of the things I think is really important about separate spaces for girls and women in sport and for boys and women in sport is, I competed in high school sports. I do amateur martial arts for fun. I hang out at a boxing gym, and I can tell you, when it's a bunch of guys in the room, we all behave in a very specific way. It's a very functional way. And they have women's hours at the gym similarly, because women behave in a very specific way. They're able to focus on things in a very specific way when guys are not there. And I think there's something very important about that. This has been brought into a lot of spiritual practices, a lot of religions similarly. Islam, for example, in most of its variations, maintains separate spaces for men and women. Like in this, sometimes it's even separate rooms in the mosques, right? But sometimes it's just separate sides. Some Judaism does that. But a lot of places will have, a lot of institutions will have men's groups and women's groups because they think it's important for women and girls to be able to speak freely amongst themselves and talk about the experience of religion as girls and women, the feminine side of it, and men to be able to talk about the masculine side of it as boys and men. Not to mention, there's also the ethical formation and the character side of it. There's the importance of men being able to speak to men frankly about how to be better men, right? I'll give you a perfect example. I was at a recent fraternity meeting, and a brother who is in his 20s was talking about the difficulties in his marriage after the birth of their first child. And he was asking for advice. How do I know what is just exhaustion? How do I know what is postpartum depression? Have you guys been through this? You guys have all been through this. There's a frankness you can have of conversation when the doors are closed and it's a bunch of guys able to talk without having to worry about what their wives are going to think about hearing it or what their sisters are going to think. And I think this is really important. And similarly, I have been around my women friends who sometimes forget I'm there and start talking about their husbands, right? Or they think I'm one of the girls, which is a catastrophe. I cannot tell you how much I hate that. Well, they'll ask me, Dheeraj, if a guy does this, and I'll tell them, I don't want to know. Please don't ask me. I don't want to know about your boyfriend. I don't want to know what he said to you. Please, I don't want to know, right? But, there's an importance to this. Homosocial relationships are really important, homosocial bonds, and especially in mystic practice and religious practice.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just so I approach that question with curiosity because I don't really come down on one side or the other of that question personally. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, how do I feel about this? And I was like, I'm on the, I can really see arguments on either side of this. Obviously, coming from a lefty liberal perspective, we've got to gender not everybody's in a binary gender. And then there's questions, especially what's come up this week of how much accommodation does society make for the minority of folks who don't fit into one gender or the other. We'll leave that aside because that's a whole other hour of conversation. We're just going to acknowledge it for people listening that question exists, but we'll leave it aside and we'll just pretend, for the purposes of this, that most people.
Can I make one addendum quickly?
Other.
One addendum. I'm so sorry. Can I make one addendum?
Yeah.
I don't think every institution has to be everything. I think it is okay for some institutions to be mixed. It is okay for some institutions to be separated. And as long as there's a good distribution of both available and people are not held back, right? Or unable to advance, I'm fine with it. If, for example, we had some kind of monopoly, like say in medieval France, where you could not have a job if you were not Catholic, or like in Pakistan, where you cannot get a job with the government if you are not a Muslim, right? If you could not get a job in Texas if you were not a Mason, that would be a real problem. And I would say, well, you know what? Well, then we got to make it open, right? To atheists too. But this is one thing in the world where there are many things, which is why I'm fine with it.
Yeah, there's just so many directions I want to go. And I'm trying not to take this too political. Obviously, we're both political people. This is not a political show. I'm doing my best. And, when you bring that up, it's interesting because we have doctrine in the Constitution where separate but equal was overruled when it comes to race. And yet we're making an argument for that in terms of gender. And so that opens a whole can of worms. Again, that's a whole nother hour discussion that I don't want to have right now, but I do kind of want to kind of bring that parallel in. The last point that you just made is interesting. I don't want to call my any of my exes out too hard or any of the specific lodges. So I'll keep it vague, but I will say the lodge that my ex was in a medium-sized town, a lot of the jobs were run by the Mason. They basically, like, anything that dude wanted or that his friends wanted, they knew a guy in the Masons that could help them out, that could get them that job, that could get them that could get them an introduction to a potential client, etc. And so when you say, oh, well, it's not like you have to be a Mason to get a job. In some of these places, the Masons really are running shit to the point that you're going to have a strong advantage of getting a job, getting a client, whatever, if you are a Mason, and women are excluded from that in a society where we are treated as if we have equal opportunity or expected to behave as if we have equal opportunity. That's not always practically the case, which probably is where it comes in. Hey, if somebody's a woman, politically, at least they kind of understand something. They've lived through something in a way that maybe men can't understand. Does that make sense?
It does. I will also say this: we're speaking at a very general level, right?
Well, we have to. We don't want to call out our friends, family. Right?
So no. So if you ask me case by case, right? Like, obviously, there will be some weird places, like say in Italy or in France, where an entirely different tradition of Masonry runs large, right? And they do have that kind of stranglehold, and so it's important to acknowledge that reality. And what I'm simply trying to speak at is at a level of, in the globe, I think it's important that we have these levels, these kinds of organizations available. And should these kinds of tyrannies arise, these kinds of chokeholds arise, I think it's important that the government step in to intervene, like as, for example, as they did in Italy, right? One of the weird things that happened there was that the government partnered with the mafia to go after Masonry. That's a pretty weird history, right? So I think it's important to make sure that nothing ever gets a chokehold. Things should be relatively separate. And I think it's funny you mentioned that about an advantage. Here in Texas, we had snowstorms and ice storms a couple of years ago. And my wife was at her parents' house. She'd stayed the night there, and I was at our house. So we were separated overnight when the ice hit. I was trying to get to her, which is normally a 16-minute drive, but because of the ice, and the roads in Texas aren't made for ice, much less our tire, it was perilous. I drive a Toyota, a little Camry, and because I live where I live, which is the Texas exurbs, there were all these guys with gigantic trucks, SUVs, and so on. And I saw all these guys just zipping by, and none of them stopped. I saw all these cars with women, many of which had their children in the back seat. And there's no guy there. It's just a woman trying to drive somewhere. And she's stuck on the ice. There's nowhere to go. So I got out of my Camry and pushed, or I got, and helped. What was normally a 16-minute drive, which should have taken me in the ice maybe with total drive time like 2.5 hours, wound up being an entire day, because I stopped to help every woman I saw, because I could very easily imagine that was my wife in the car with my baby, right? And even though I just had a Camry with no tow hitch or anything like that, I had shoulder power, so to speak. I could push. And when other guys saw some guy stopped to push, it shamed them into stopping to help, right? Other guys would stop. But otherwise, up until I was the first one out, most of these guys are just driving on by in their Jeeps. And I could rationalize some of it. Like, I thought maybe they're speeding off to get their dad to an oncology clinic. Maybe they've got their wife's medication, whatever. Most of it, I figured they just couldn't be bothered, right? Who cares? Once commerce was restored, after the roads were cleared, I took every precaution I could for my wife. And I said, you know what? I know this may seem dumb, but I'm going to put Masonic decals on your car. Because if someone is inclined to drive by, if he sees you with a flat tire, maybe seeing this will shame him. Maybe if he's a member of the fraternity and sees a decal indicating wife of a Mason, he'll think twice, because we do take obligations. We take oaths. We call them obligations to help wives, sisters, aunts, mothers, and so on of brother Masons, because this goes back for a very long time, when most secret societies and fraternities were basically collectives to help families if a man died.
Yeah, and it kind of circles back around to something I was going to say earlier, which is these organizations date back to times when society was very segregated in terms of vocation and in terms of everything else. When it was, oh, men make the money, provide for the family, women take care of the family at home. There are very separate experiences of being a man and a woman vocationally speaking. And so when you go to a church or your religious organization, it makes sense to be separate. It makes sense to kind of talk about, men have things to talk about in terms of finance and politics that women weren't involved in at the time. Women are talking about things that men weren't involved with at the time around childbirth, child rearing, their lives being at stake in a lot of those situations, and how to deal with that. What's interesting now is that we've created a society where vocationally we don't have as much segregation. Obviously, there are vocations that are heavier on one side or the other, men or women, we still have that. But for the most part, every job, every vocation is open to all genders by law in most places. I'm obviously, American and speaking American centric, and there's lots of places in the world where this isn't true. Let's just talk about America for a second, because that's what I know. And I'm the host. Um, everybody's allowed to do whatever. A lot of professions, especially white collar professions like the ones you and I work in, are very mixed gender wise, and so we're expected to have this similar sort of experience in our day-to-day lives, and in this type of person, at least that we're talking about. You go home to your family, you're expected to have everybody's helping with the chores, everybody's helping with the kids, there's a lot more kind of equality, and yet we have these organizations where there's still separate experiences. Now I can say, as a woman, obviously there are still experiences that women have that men can't have, never have, will never know about. It was interesting you talking about your road anecdote, because my first thought was, I'm identifying with the woman in the car, and your first thought was, what if that was my wife or my sister? Not what if that was me, in the car, not being able to move. So that was kind of interesting thought experiment. Obviously men don't understand anything about what it's like to be pregnant, or the existential threat of what it's like to have your life threatened every time that happens, which is still much more common than people realize. And so, which is probably where your ex was coming from when she said, "Hey, I'm gonna identify with a woman more than somebody of my same race, ethnicity, etc." Right? So there's still a lot of that going on. But like for men, what's going on in terms of, I still feel like I have these unique challenges as a provider that women don't understand, when women are working in the same jobs, and statistically, more and more often are the breadwinners at home, especially in the United States. Women are now more educated than men in the United States, are surpassing men in terms of college degrees. Women are more and more often the breadwinner at home. So where is the unique challenge of men? Is it about, I am still supposed to be that, and it's getting harder and harder for me to be that because there's women competing now for that? Or what is it?
I think thinking about it in terms of economic challenges is perhaps a good starting point, but is sort of maybe but a few facets of the gem. A better way to think about it is that there are ways of experiencing the world that happen when you have, say, one, let's just call it a neurological profile, right? Um, and I'm saying that very carefully because we know, for example, that because of psychiatry, that the way one's body chemistry works can really impact cognition, experience, emotion, right? Now, add to this hormones, add to this a whole lot of just simply how your body is, right? Your awareness of it. And this is a very simple thing, like just, so to speak, how you are in your body, how you live in your body, how you feel in it, right? Very simple thing, but it's a very big difference between how men and women experience life at a very fundamental level, right? Like just basic neurology and basic cognition is just fantastically different accordingly. I'm not suggesting there's any difference in quality between them or difference in value, right? But there is a big difference. And one of the really interesting things I've seen about this is if you talk to people who undergo, I'm not sure what the polite word is these days. They call it Yeah, thank you. And they start with hormone treatment. They will talk to you about how they just feel fantastically different, right? Once the testosterone or the estrogen starts getting in them, right? So if you just start from that simple base fact that the simple way you experience the world neurologically is very different, right? Everything accordingly builds on that. There's, regardless of what the expectations about jobs or money or anything else may be, there are still tremendous amounts of social expectations and behavioral expectations that impact men and women in very specific ways. I'm going to use a different name for this. One of my best friends is a woman. Let's call her Megan. Megan, all through her 20s, dated a bunch of losers. She is someone who is so awesome that when I met her in my high school Latin class, and this is how old I am. I had an address book back then. I wrote it in pen. I put her name and her phone number, because we didn't have email address then. We were just studying. And I wrote Ne plus ultra, which means in Latin, there's nothing better than this. She was just awesome, right? I think she is still awesome. But all through her 20s, she dated total losers. And one day I asked her, why do you date such losers? Right? Like, why is, like, and she told me, I'm never going to forget this because it showed me just how differently she experienced the world. And she said, I can only say yes to the guys who ask. And that was so fascinating to me because in her understanding of the world, it was not possible for her to see a non-loser go up to him and say, I would like to go on a date with you, right? She just had to pick from what was offered to her, right? There's just a very fundamentally, basically different understanding of how we interact in the world, right? Much less with each other. And, you'll notice in the example I brought up about my wife driving around, I didn't say anything about the women who drove by in their SUVs. I didn't say anything about the women who drove by in their trucks. I saw plenty of them. It was the men whom I was appalled by, right? There's this very different expectations about how we interact.
It's just interesting because obviously I'm a woman, or so much as so everybody treats me. I look like one, right? And I feel I've had people come out of my body and all that sort of thing. I have never felt like I didn't have any control over who asked me on a date. I've never had any problem if I wanted to make a little eye contact, And so, and I'm just saying that in terms of one woman's experience is one data point. It doesn't mean all women feel this way, experience the world this way. All men feel this way, experience the world this way. When we talk about, and I want to get off this because I do want to get onto some of the like woo woo stuff for a second before we run out of time. But I just want to say, it's okay for us to have a different perspective. But I want to say for people listening, I have a different perspective on this, in that I do think there's a lot of gray area and a lot of room for individualism in the way that we perceive the world. And I do think different people perceive the world differently. I think, in fact, each individual human perceives the world in a unique and different way, and that we start to get into trouble when we start to lump people into all people like this think this way, and we have outlawed that when it comes to racial things, but we do it with gender.
Just speaking at a very high level of abstraction, right? So, like, for example, if you say something like, most Muslims don't eat pork, or most Jews
Sure.
don't eat pork, that is at the level of abstraction I'm speaking about, right? Like, it is absolutely not meant to say women are passive people who do not have any control over their lives. It was just an example of like how it was illuminating to me that somebody's experience of something could be so very different, right?
Yeah.
And something relating to how she interacts with men. That's the only reason I brought it up. Because when I've told that anecdote to a lot of people, they've all said, oh yeah, I totally feel that way too, right? Like, it's...
Well, and a lot of people are socialized that way, and it goes into a circle of, how what's natural versus what's socialization versus what's reinforced in which way, and all kinds of stuff we don't have time to get into. But what I do want to get into, and what's an interesting question to me, is the gender difference in the personal growth and development world. Why I think the Masons is interesting as a men's organization is because it's one of the only, not the only, but certainly the largest and one of the only organizations that encourages men specifically to follow a path of personal growth and development and to get into religion with it, to get into mysticism with it, that's not specifically tied to any one religion and one sort of set of doctrine, but just in a general, hey, believe in a higher power, be a good person, and come and let's figure out how to do this together. And in most personal growth and development spaces that I go into that are ostensibly mixed gender spaces, you walk in and it's 80% women, 20% men, 90% women, 10% men. I've wondered why, and I've brought it, and we've discussed it on the show before, why there's such a difference in interest in personal growth and development and kind of spiritual development between women and men. And I'm encouraged by the fact that organizations exist to try to kind of correct that balance a little bit. But why do you think that is naturally, that women gravitate more towards spiritual personal development and men need to be more crowbarred? I don't know what the right word is. That they're not as naturally attracted to it, as we're generalizing most men, right?
So as we talk about it, I wouldn't say that my observation is that. What I would say is that most men that I come across are deeply suspicious of anything that involves their money and their obligation, right? Anything that they have to make promises about and anything that they would have to pay for in a way that I would say borders on pathological, right? So let's put that out there. But guys are very deeply suspicious, I think, of obedience or of anything that would compel obedience. But I think on top of that, there's also this idea of the language in which, or the sort, and I'm using language in a very abstract way, the language in which things are marketed, right? How do you appeal to somebody? What is a persuasion? The language of Masonry is really appealing to guys because they talk about it being very difficult. They talk about it being a struggle even. And these are things you will do to overcome the worst parts of yourselves. These are things that you will do in the company of other guys. And it's a language that's very, very appealing to men. In fact, so much so that of all the major fraternal organizations, all of which are in decline, we are in decline the least, which means we are doing something more successfully to battle the economic forces that are hitting the social institutions, right? Mormons and certain Catholics have done a pretty good job with this too. I've seen this in AA as well. There are meetings that I've gone to, and I've been sober now for 11 years, right? Coming 11 years in October, I guess I should say. So like a few months from now. Meetings tend to be really, really successful, I think, when people can focus on it being a meeting where people go to do work, not a social space. Maybe you socialize before or after the meeting, but the meeting has to be the meeting, right? And what I have found is that the meetings that are deeply unsuccessful are the meetings that devolve into social contexts where people start hanging out, do the AA part to just get it out of the way and then go hang out. Or they do it as a way of dating and meeting sober people, right? And oftentimes people will do it as a way of, frankly, having homosocial relationships with sober people, right? Meeting other sober guys, meeting other sober women, right? It can get pretty messy, pretty stupid pretty quickly because you have a bunch of emotionally fragile people, What I think happens with guys is that it takes a lot already for guys to be comfortable being vulnerable. And like if you go to an AA meeting, for example, most guys will probably attend for a good 6 or 8 months before they will say anything. Like they will sit in the back or they will just attend and say, hi, my name is Dheeraj, I'm an alcoholic, but they will not say anything about their lives, right? Or their addictions. A lot of these spaces, like that you would describe as personal growth are not very receptive, I think, to the slow velocity with which men open up to vulnerability. They are more oriented to a feminine cadence and velocity, and that can be a little tough.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I'm gonna be thinking about that more as I develop my own work and training in the personal growth and development space. So thank you for putting that idea into my head. I really appreciate that. I feel like we could just keep talking for like 5 more hours, and maybe we should just record 5 more podcast episodes. But unfortunately, we're
Yeah, we should
at time
get
today.
to the woo some other time. Yeah,
We'll get
this
to
was
the
a lot of fun.
we'll get to the and sometimes it goes where it goes, and that's cool. Dheeraj, thank you so much for being with us. If anybody wants to connect with you, where should they look to find you?
You can give them my email, or you can dheerajchand.com. You can find me through there. And if you want my work, if you want me for work, find me at generalizations.com. But other than that, but yeah. Or if you're interested in Masonry, I live in Austin, Texas. Come to see us at Austin Lodge 12.
Austin Lodge 12. Love it. Thank you so much for being with us today. And everybody else, we'll see you next time.